We are honored to be joined tonight by District of Columbia Ward 6 Councilmember Charles Allen, who is the chair of the Council's Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, Councilmember Allen has been a champion of our community since joining the council and was recently our key partner in securing an additional $2.7 million in funding for the LGBTQ community in the current budget cycle. In addition, Councilmember Allen led on authorizing the DC Emergency Police and Justice Reform Bill that was recently passed and signed into law. One of the key provisions he and his colleagues worked to ensure was a part of the new law is the creation of the DC Public Reform Commission. We are grateful, Councilmember, to you for coming on to meet with us tonight as a friend of our LGBTQ community and for your tireless support of SMYAL. Please join me in welcoming Councilmember Charles Allen. Councilmember, to get us started, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Absolutely. Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be with you. So, yeah, I'm Charles Allen, so I'm the Ward 6 council member. I have been in this job for about 6 years. Prior to that, I was the chief of staff to the former Ward 6 council member, Tommy Wells. So all told, I feel like it's been about 15 years working at the council as either staff or the elected official. Before that, I actually was on the other side of the equation. I was an advocate. So I worked for the DC Primary Care Association. My background's actually in public health. And so when I moved to the district, I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, but I didn't really see my future there. Don't tell my mother, but I really felt like, I really wanted to come to DC where I felt like I could make a lot more change and was excited by the opportunities. I first started with the federal government and quickly realized I didn't like that much at all. The pace was too slow. I felt really disconnected from the communities that I was trying to work with, but quickly had fallen in love with the district. I mean, it was home very quickly. So I found my way to the DC Primary Care Association, where we worked on expanding healthcare access, on expanding health insurance, helping stand up our free clinics, our community health centers all across the city. And so in that vein, I was at the council, pounding the table and advocating and trying to push them to do more and take the steps. And then ultimately, when I had the opportunity to actually put my name on a ballot and ask people to support me and realize that I could be on the other side of that and help make those decisions, it was a great opportunity, and I'm really just honored that the good folks at Ward 6 sent me there once and then thought I did a decent enough job to send me back again. And I've got a great team around me that helps me do my job, and I'm grateful for them too, and just love it. And more than anything, especially you think about the moment we're in right now, we're elected really to try to deal with the hard things, like that. Some of the easy stuff, that's not really all that difficult. We're dealing with the hard stuff right now. And whether it's on budget, whether it's on policy, whether it's on tough conversations that need to be had, this is why you get into public service. And this is why you have to have trust and faith in the system of accountability that we have. And you really want to be that change agent. And so it's both a sobering and exciting moment to be in public service at this time. But I'm glad to do it and glad to have great partners like SMYAL and everyone else with us to help think through how we move our city forward.
Thank you. And as a former public servant myself, having worked both at the state and federal level, I absolutely appreciate where you are coming from in that vein. So thank you so much. As chair of the DC Council Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, we know that you have been a leader in policing and criminal justice reform, as well as allocating funding to social service programs such as ours. Can you tell us about those efforts and the outcome from the recent budget negotiations and process?
Yeah, it's a little bit intertwined, I guess, kind of between the budget that we've just essentially wrapped up, and as well as some of the policy changes. I'll do my best to try to tie them together. If you had asked me this question in February, you'd probably get a very different answer. But the global pandemic, like everywhere else, has just absolutely been a wrecking ball through our economy. So from a budget perspective, we've had to figure out how to close a gap of about $1.5 billion in the budget. And at the same time, we have a lot of people that are hurting. And so how do we do a budget in a way that tries to go after the supports needed for the people that are hurting the most and feeling this the most. I am glad and proud of a lot of the work that we got done in the budget. I would still argue that we didn't do enough, and we still have to do a lot more as we come back to it. But then layer on top of that, that global health pandemic, we also, of course, had the murder of George Floyd and a much more heightened sense of the reforms that are needed around policing in our city. And I'd expand it beyond just policing to really talking about racial justice. And certainly from the committee's perspective, on one hand, it almost feels like this moment hit the city really fast. On the others, I mean, we've been holding hearings talking about racial justice issues for a couple of years. So it really felt like it came together in a moment that allowed us to push aggressively on legislative reforms, push aggressively on budgetary reforms. But, you know, as I kind of talk to my colleagues and others, you know, we cannot feel like we pat ourselves on the back because we passed a police emergency bill or that we passed a budget that had some good things in it. If that's all we did, then we have failed this moment. We really have to be committed to recognizing that we took a big step and an important step, but that there are many more steps to come. And I think that my colleagues are there. I think that the city is really there. When I talk to folks, they really seem to get a sense of we're at a pivotal transitional moment, and we're called to bigger actions. And I think people are recognizing that a change has to come, and there are going to be big steps along the way to make that happen. So to the question around the budget, I think we really worked hard at trying to be responsive to the moment by removing some funds, for example, from MPD, by cutting the policing budget, redirecting that into community efforts, gun violence prevention, so many other things. And I know we'll talk about some more specifics on with SMYAL in just a little bit. But we really tried to reinvest it back into the community. And I think that was a really important step. It was a controversial step, but I made some of my colleagues a little bit anxious as we went through that process. But I'm glad that we took that step. I think it's an important one. But kind of to my point again, it's got to be a continued, sustained effort that we're going to have to take over multiple budgets, because we didn't get to the place we are today with one law or one budget or overnight. It is the accumulation of decades of racism and injustice. And so, as a legislator, I know that there's not going to be a single law or a single budget that completely undoes it. We have to be committed to the path that really, that takes big steps along the way, but is a path to build a safe and just city.
Indeed, yes, and thank you for those steps in the right direction. One of the things that we had the opportunity to do was work very closely with you to secure additional funds for LGBTQ youth and really the LGBTQ community writ large. Can you tell us about that partnership? What additional resources were you able to secure for our youth and for our community?
Yeah, to me, this is actually this is a great example of the leadership from SMYAL. So, SMYAL, I don't have to tell you, obviously, but just has such a pivotal role on the ground serving our community, but also has a really important role as a policymaker, because you help make sure that we know what's going on and then help guide us in partnership around key decisions that we need to make, help inform budgetary decisions, legislative decisions. And so I think this is a great example of that. We know when we think about our LGBTQ youth at risk of experiencing homelessness, or when we think about, especially workforce, this is something that's going to be really important for us to focus on our workforce development program. And it's about $500,000. I think it's going to be a really important part of how we help serve just our city and do better. We've been hearing about this for a while, so I'm really proud that we were able to put that into the budget. We also have funded a survey of transgender government employees' workplace experiences and district government hiring and recruiting practices. And I think this is important because it will start to really make sure that we as a government are doing and taking the types of steps that we need to. And so I think that's really important. And then we've also funded new staff at the Office on Human Rights that are going to focus specifically on hate crime education and coordination among and between government and LGBTQ organizational partners. So I think there's several efforts that have kind of come together in this budget, but I'll say we couldn't have been able to do that without just wonderful advocates and allies that help us know what type of decisions and priorities we need to make.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I just want to remind folks that we are taking audience submitted questions. So if you do have a question for the council member, please feel free to use the chat feature on your screen to type your question. And our colleague Sharifa will be tracking those and sending them to me. We'll be answering some of those questions in a little bit. Council member, as we look towards the future, are there additional priorities when it comes to our community and in particular our youth? Are there resources or programs that you're trying to secure? We would just love to know any of that information as we obviously are talking tonight with our major donors.
Well, I guess in some degree I try to think, so with the hat that I have in the seat that I'm in from a judiciary and public safety perspective, I'll just give this one little shout out as hopefully something we can work on in the future, because I think it helps empower the community that you're helping serve and lead. I also get to have oversight over elections. And one of the things that I have really been working on over the last couple of years is everything from public financing for our campaigns to get big money out of our campaign process, obviously managing things like vote by mail and opening up a lot of campaign finance reforms. But I also believe it's important for our youth to vote. So I led an effort that got really close, and I'm hoping we can come back to it soon, and that was to lower the voting age to 16. And I think that I've met so many amazing 16 and 17-year-olds that have every ability to cast an intelligent, smart, thoughtful vote as any 70 or 80-year-old could. I think that empowering young voices is one of the ways that we as elected officials do a better job of listening to them, because at the end of the day, what is it that I need? I need votes, right? So we need to create a way that young people have a stronger voice in this process, because it will force elected officials and candidates to pay more attention to those young people. And the commodity that elected officials need are votes at the end of the day. So give a vote to a young person, and it will force more elected officials to have to take them seriously, to listen to them, and to be responsive to them. So I'm hoping we can bring that back at some point, and I think that'll be important for our young people. But I also think about the intersection that often happens with our young people in the criminal justice system. And so we're working hard on trying to think through the types of changes and reforms to reduce the impact and contact that our young people have with courts and with the criminal justice system. And some of that has to do with sentencing reform. So we're trying, but once someone has touched, we are trying to think about how do we create more fair and just sentencing, especially when we see young people that have been essentially locked away. And we all know our sentencing laws are incredibly racist in terms of the way they play out. So we're working on those issues, which help our young people and emerging adults all the way through age 25. But we're also looking at how we change our juvenile criminal justice system so that those touches really are much more restorative in nature rather than punitive in nature. Certainly there's going to be accountability when harm is done, but can you do it in a way with a young person that has a restorative justice angle to it that frankly leaves everybody whole? That is accountability. One of the things that bothers me is when people try to think about accountability somehow isn't restorative justice. It is. It just may not look in the same law and order way that some people think about it, but how do we achieve that? So I think there's a lot that we're doing in our committee, whether it's on kind of that voting expansion or trying to rethink our criminal justice system. And there's so many more ways, but those are some of the ideas I think that we can really focus on in the coming months and years ahead around how we help our young people both, survive. How do we help eliminate barriers and reduce the barrier from ever getting there in the first place, and then empowering them to be able to have a stronger say and frankly hold elected officials accountable when they ignore those young voices.
Mm-hmm. You touched a lot on this through that answer about addressing really the intersecting needs of our community, in particular thinking about race and access to services, but also about how systems like the criminal justice system, really play out for folks of color. I'm wondering in particular, I'm taking a little bit of moderator's privilege here in tweaking this final question that I have for you, which is so many of our youth are, of course, dealing with the issue of poverty. And we know that poverty is a major obstacle for so many LGBTQ youth, especially of color. And I'm just wondering, from your vantage point on the council, what can both government do, but also community groups such as ourselves and individuals like myself living in the district do to address poverty and really try and reduce that in mind as we do this work?
Well, I think there's a lot within that, so I'll do my best to try to give an answer that's somewhat concise. But in so many ways, our city is not equitable. You know, and we can go through the litany of ways in which we have not met our obligations yet. And I think in particular, when you talk about poverty, I think we need to, as policymakers and as the public, we need to not be afraid to ask those that have the means to be able to shoulder more of the burden. You know, I had proposed a couple of weeks ago in the budget, I had proposed, for example, a fairly moderate income tax increase on people who earn $250,000 a year. For someone who earns $500,000 a year, all they'd be asked for is $45 a month. Couldn't get it through the council. That to me says a lot about where we are in terms of prioritizing equity. We need to be able to do that because we've got to be able to figure out how are we going to help support the young person you're talking about who's struggling with homelessness, trauma, poverty. We can't do it unless we're willing to go and ask people to say, hey, you're probably weathering this storm pretty well. You know, you're teleworking from home. You're not paying for the dog walker, or, you know, you're not paying for lunches out. I mean, like, there's a lot of people that are doing okay. And those are the high income earners. The people that are hurting, the 100,000 people that lost their jobs and have unemployment claims, the people who aren't sure if they've got a roof over their head next month, the folks that are struggling with rent, that's where we've got to go prioritize our focus. And so, you know, I think we have an eviction crisis that is coming once we get through this pandemic that is going to be devastating. And we've been trying to work, for example, around, we now have essentially almost a right to counsel for people facing eviction so that they have attorneys that help them in landlord court. We've got to have a lot of strategies around that. But at the end of the day, we've got to think about how this works from a finance standpoint. You know, when you ask about poverty, look at to me, I look at the debate that's happening right now, where we realize with the pandemic and the extra unemployment funds, the $600 per week, what that has meant on the federal level to somebody to be able to survive, to be able to pay rent, food, all the costs that go on. And it's about to go away. I think it actually probably triggers for a lot of us a conversation around, you know, where are we with just a universal basic income? You know, where are we with recognizing that it is probably in everyone's best interest to make sure that we have the type of funding that people need to be able to survive. And DC is an expensive city, so so many people, but you know, I think we have to really reorient our heads a little bit on equity and what it means to ask something of other people to really help the folks that are hurting the most, not just in this economy and a pandemic, but even without a pandemic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to a couple of audience questions. One of the things that folks definitely jumped on was issues like lowering the voting age. So the question is, what can advocates do to help support issues like that so that we can see that as a potential reality soon?
Yeah. So we had introduced it. I'll try to give you kind of the inside scoop about kind of what happened. You know, so we had introduced it. We had a fantastic hearing. We got huge support all over the place. We moved the legislation through committee, and things were looking good. We went up to the full council, and to be honest, I had a chairman who did not support this at all. The mayor, who was not strongly supported it, I think was a little bit agnostic, but hasn't really been a strong supporter of this. And then I had a couple of council members, in particular, the former Ward 2 council member was adamantly against this, and really put a lot of pressure on some of my colleagues. And we saw a couple of votes slip away at the last minute, and we lost by 1 vote. I think the political dynamics have changed. Obviously, we have a different Ward 2 council member now. But I think that one of the ways to help continue to build pressure on that is to go to my colleagues, and the two people who kind of changed their votes, our Ward 8 council member and Trayon White, and Anita Bonds, our at-large council member, helping remind them that they had supported this and this is a priority, and letting them know it's a priority for you, so that when we do bring it back up, we can get their support this time around.
Thank you. What is sort of a good segue to the next question. One of the things that folks experience a lot at, with local politics, and I myself have worked at the municipal level, at the state level. I was working in the state legislature in Massachusetts. I know that for a lot of folks, the process itself doesn't seem very transparent, even though there are public hearings, and before COVID, folks could go and meet with their legislators. So the question is, how can we make sure that going forward, that in particular youth feel that government is accessible, that they are learning about the process? And honestly, a personal question of mine, how do we make sure that our young people also, as you noted, not only just can vote, but really be interested in running one day and doing, the job that you're doing today?
Exactly. I mean, listen, if I'm still doing the same job I'm doing right now in 20 years, please someone run against me and kick me out. Like you're not supposed to do that. So we want young people to get engaged, to run and be our future public servants and our public leaders, right? To your question around the kind of the transparency and engagement piece, I think this is something that it only gets better with effort. And, I think it's something we always have to be aware of and working on. But I think back to about a year ago, I sat down with, and I know probably Japer is somewhere on this call, but, Japer and several other folks came and said, listen, we don't feel like the city, the council's budget process has really reflected our priorities. We don't think you've heard us. And sometimes elected officials, we can get our back up sometimes when we hear that and say, well, wait a minute, we're doing good things. Say thank you. But we have to really challenge ourselves to not do that, and to realize that when we have leaders and advocates that come to us and say, we don't feel listened to, we don't feel respected, we don't feel prioritized, that's really a challenge to us. And I know Japer did this and others as well, really constructively challenged us and said, all right, we're going to boil it down for you. We're going to focus it for you. Here are the things that we need to see and we want to see, and we want to work with you to achieve that. And I'll tell you, as a policymaker, it was really helpful to be able to have a very candid, frank conversation, but a very honest one that helped us think through policies. And that then translated into actions that we directly took in the budget and in other actions. So I think sometimes it's just, we both have to, we all have to make the effort. The elected officials need to make the effort. We need to hear from you. Because sometimes things do fall to the side, not because of intentionality, but because of either miscommunication, misunderstanding, or just benign ignorance, just not knowing. And so I think that when we try to come to each other in a way that tries to believe in each other's motives and believes in each other's causes, and then tries to say, okay, let me hear it, that's important. All right. One of my former boss told me something early on that I've always remembered, and he said one of the biggest challenges in this job is to always work hard when someone comes to you to hear it as if you're hearing it for the first time. And that to me is really important, is that if you, I get thousands of emails every day, the action alerts that constantly come in. So sometimes it can start to feel a little overwhelming, and it kind of can start to just take over and a little drown out some of the other elements. So it's a challenge to always make sure we're always trying to listen and hear something as if we're hearing it for the first time. And when we do that, we can really hear where those priorities are and find those partnerships. And that's something that I know I'm committed to working on. My staff, it's kind of just a core belief of how we try to operate. And but if you find elected officials that aren't doing it, or if you ever feel that we're not doing it, speak to us. We're accountable to you.
Thank you so much. We have absolutely enjoyed this last half an hour with you, Councilmember. You again are just such a great friend of our community. You are welcome anytime to any of our events, and I'm sure we will be chatting with you soon as we continue our work together. So I want to once again thank Charles Allen for joining us. If folks could please give a round of thank yous in that way. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Evening,
Have a
Charles.
wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.